who is in charge of the meetings, and how do others know about it?
I think that if there were a group of, say, 30 disciples or 300 disciples or 3,000 disciples in Jesus' day, and they were all gathering around him to sing to him or to hear his teaching, and somebody said, who's in charge of this meeting? Surely they would have had to answer, Jesus is in charge of this meeting. Surely. Now, again, the common experience for people today is that someone has been hired or someone is on staff, someone professionally is in charge of the meeting, and you know who it is. I mean, he's going to come up and he's going to introduce everything. Everything's going to ricochet off of him. You know, even if other people do things, it's back to him, back to him, back to him, back to him, back to him. And, you know, maybe you'll get a big introduction. Here's Johnny. You know, maybe there's, you know, something. It sort of builds up around a person in a normal setting. You know, usually it's pretty easy to identify who's in charge of the meeting. Well, if Jesus is in charge of the meeting, then there needs to be enough relationship with God that people know when to shut up, they know when to speak up, they're willing to listen to God. When revelation comes the second, let the first one sit down. The whole thing is on the even ground of you are all brothers. You have no CEO or master of ceremonies. You know, that actually at any given time there's going to be people that because of their particular gift and because of what's currently going on are going to speak up, are going to reach out, are going to do what they need to do because of the gift of God that's in them or the conviction that's in them. And I think it's something to be pretty wary of if there's, you know, we talked earlier about something being man-centered. If it's always the same person that's emceeing and, you know, he's got to be there, otherwise the show can't go on. If he's the one that everything bounces off of constantly, rather than things circling around Jesus and relating to people in a circular fashion around Jesus, if it's not really that, but it's everything comes off of the top of the pyramid, bounces off of him, then you've got something that's man-centered and unfruitful, and it's going to hurt other people. There will be leadership in the meetings in the sense that if something's going wrong, you'll see the gifts come forward to solve the problems. If there needs to be some sort of teaching in response to something that's happening, you'll see that come forth. If there are gifts that relate to worship, someone is just desperately in love with God and capable of drawing other people to that place too, the same way King David was. You'll see that gift come forward at a time where rejoicing is appropriate, or drawing our hearts and minds back to God are appropriate, or, you know, I mean, you'll see those gifts function, and depending on the circumstance, you'll see different things happen. There are gifts of leadership and visible gifts and invisible gifts, so you're going to see some are more visible than others perhaps, but it isn't going to be dependent on one person or three people or something like that if it's really a priesthood of believers.
Well, some might object that would lead to chaos if you didn't have an MC. Do you want to address that?
Well, yeah, and I'd agree completely that it could lead to chaos if we're really not in touch with God. And if it led to chaos, we really need to stop and ask ourselves, and probably right on the spot if we weren't trying to put on a show. And that's where a lot of the thing comes in. The services are essentially oftentimes kind of what we call in the business world dog and pony shows. It was something we put on while the big shots are in town, and then they leave and we go back to normal life. Well, you know, a lot of times the services are to present an image to visitors, to try to get more people to come so that we'll have more members and our church will grow, and there's volumes of books written on church growth, you know, that sort of idea. We need to appeal, we need to be culture current, we need to find a way to present the gospel in a package that's acceptable to men's selfish carnal natures, and you know, there's all these kinds of things that have worked their way into God's people's perception of what church ought to be, with psychology and demographics and a lot of things like that. And frankly, if chaos came up, if we weren't trying to put on a show, we could stop and say, we got a lot of chaos right now. Maybe we could pray about this. If Jesus is the head, where the Spirit of God is, there's liberty. And God is not a God of chaos. He's a God of order. Again, that's in 1 Corinthians 14, where it talks about everyone bringing a word of instruction and revelation, song, tongue, so on, interpretation. And so God apparently thinks all those things can happen and still be order. That's the right way to be, according to the Scriptures. And yet God is a God of order. And it's a selfish nature and sin in our hearts, or lack of understanding of God's ways, the inability to hear God, that brings chaos. If God's a God of order and we're in touch with the head, then the body's going to be moving in harmony with Him. And we've seen so many just devastatingly brilliant examples of God's wisdom, of how someone would be talking about their day at work, and then someone would say, I've been reading in Galatians about that very thing, and someone said, I just wrote a song last night about that. And he would share the song that he'd just written that's exactly the same thing, even using the same scriptures. And this happens so many times. So after 8 years of seeing God do what He wants to do, and that is to an extent, as far as we're capable, be head, we've at least put ourselves in a situation where He could be, rather than writing Him out of the script, and because we're afraid something will go wrong, or afraid there'll be chaos, or afraid it won't be a motivating, inspirational service, or the worship won't be, squeaky clean or whatever. Because of all of our fears and inhibitions and lack of communion with the head, things have got into chaos in places around, unless it's controlled by all the script and the choreography. But the truth is, if we'll be daring and courageous and cultivate a relationship with God together,